everyone, welcome back to my channel, Why Right. Today's topic of discussion is understanding logic and recognizing logical fallacies in arguments. Our objectives for today are to understand logic, review the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, review syllogism, understand logical fallacies, and identify common logical fallacies. Now, in order to be effective, an argument has to be persuasive. And in order for it to be persuasive, your argument must have three rhetorical appeals. The first appeal is the appeal to reason, which is logos. The second is the appeal to emotion, which is pathos. And the third appeal is the appeal to authority, which is ethos. Today, we will focus on logos, which is logic. It is concerned with the principles of correct reasoning. By studying logic, we learn the rules that determine the validity of arguments. In other words, logic enables us to tell whether a conclusion correctly follows from a set of statements or assumptions. Reasoning. Deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning moves from general statements or premises to specific conclusions. The process of deduction has traditionally been illustrated with a syllogism, which consists of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Inductive reasoning begins with specific observations or evidence and goes on to draw a general conclusion. Scientists use induction. The scientific method is a way of using induction to find answers to questions. The scientific method proposes a hypothesis and then makes a series of observations to test this hypothesis. Based on the observations, the researcher arrives at a conclusion that confirms, modifies, or disproves the hypothesis. Now, what are syllogisms? A syllogism is valid when its conclusion follows logically from its premises. A syllogism is true when the premises are consistent with the facts. To be sound, a syllogism must be both valid and true. Now let's consider the following valid syllogism. The minor premise is all state universities must accommodate disabled students. The major premise is Arkansas State University is a state, ASU is a state university. Therefore, ASU must accommodate disabled students. In this syllogism, both the major premise and the minor premise are factual statements. If both of these premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. And because the syllogism is both valid and true, it is also sound. However, a syllogism can be valid without being true. For example, a major premise could be all recipients of support services are wealthy. Then Dylan is a recipient of support services. Therefore, Dylan is wealthy. As illogical as this may seem, the syllogism is valid. Its conclusion follows logically from its premise. The major premise states that the recipients of support services, all such recipients, are wealthy. However, the premise is clearly false. Some recipients of support services may be wealthier, but more are probably not. For this reason, even though the syllogism is valid, it is not true. So we have to keep in mind that the validity is a test of an argument structure, not of its soundness. Now let's look at some examples. Deductive reasoning. Major premise. All Americans are guaranteed freedom of speech by the Constitution. Minor premise. Sarah is an American. Therefore, Sarah is guaranteed freedom of speech. Inductive reasoning. Nearly 80% of the ocean's pollution comes from runoff. Runoff pollution can make ocean water unsafe for fish and people. In some areas, runoff pollution has forced beaches to be closed. Drinking water can be contaminated by runoff. After studying these observations, you can use inductive reason to conclude that runoff pollution is a problem that must be addressed. Now, let's keep in mind, this is a small example. When we're looking at inductive reasoning and as it relates to the scientific method, there are additional steps to get to the conclusion that we need to get to. Now, what are fallacies? Fallacies are common errors in reasoning that will undermine the logic of your argument. Fallacies can either be illegitimate arguments or irrelevant points and are often identified because the lack of evidence that supports their claim. Avoid these common fallacies in your own arguments and watch out for them in arguments of others. Recognizing logical fallacies. Sometimes you will encounter arguments in which writers attack the opposition by basing their arguments on questionable and sometimes false assumptions. Certain rules must be followed to ensure fairness within an argument or debate. Some examples: slippery slope. This is a conclusion based on the premise that if A happens, then eventually through a series of small steps, through B, C, X, Y, and Z will happen too, basically equating A and Z. So if we don't want Z to occur, A must not be allowed to occur either. If we ban Hummers because they're bad for the environment, eventually the government will ban all cars. So we should not ban Hummers. In this example, the author is equating banning Hummers with banning all cars, which is not the same thing. Hasty generalization. This is a conclusion based on insufficient or biased evidence. In other words, you are rushing to a conclusion before you have all of the relevant facts. Even though it's only the first day, I can tell this is going to be a boring class. In this example, the author is basing his evaluation of the entire class only on the first day, which is notoriously boring and full of housekeeping tasks for most courses. To make a fair and reasonable evaluation, the author must attend not one but several classes and possibly even examine a textbook, talk to the professor, or talk to others who have previously finished a course in order to have sufficient evidence to base a conclusion. Post hoc. This is a conclusion that assumes that if A occurred after B, then B must have been the cause. Example: I drank bottled water and now I'm sick, so the water must have made me sick. In this example, the author assumes that if one event chronologically follows another, the first event must have caused the second. But the illness could have been caused by the burrito the night before, a flu bug that had been working on the body for days, or a chemical spill across campus. There is no reason without more evidence to assume the water caused the person to be sick. Circular reason. This restates the argument rather than actually proving it. Example: George Bush is a good communicator because he speaks effectively. In this example, the conclusion that Bush is a good communicator and the evidence used to prove it is he speaks effectively are basically the same idea. Specific examples such as using everyday language, breaking down complex problems, or illustrating his points with humorous stories would be needed to prove either half of the sentence. Logical fallacies, ad hominem. This is a personal attack. This is an attack on the character of the person rather than his or her opinion or argument. Where do we see this at the most? Example: Greenpeace's strategies aren't effective because they are all dirty, lazy hippies. In this particular example, the author doesn't even name particular strategies Greenpeace has suggested, much less evaluate those strategies on their merits. Instead, the author attacks the characters of the individuals in the group. Straw man. This move oversimplifies an opponent's viewpoint and then attacks the hollow argument. Example: People who don't support the proposed state minimum wage increase hate the poor. In this example, the author attributes the worst possible motive to an opponent's position. In reality, however, the opposition probably has more complex and sympathetic arguments to support their point. By not addressing those arguments, the author is not treating the opposition with respect or refuting their position properly. Either or, false dilemma. This is a conclusion that oversimplifies the argument by reducing it to only two sides or choices. We can either stop using cars or destroy the earth. In this example, the two choices are presented as the only options, yet the author ignores a range of choices. In between, such are developing cleaner technology, car sharing systems for necessities and emergencies, or better community planning to discourage daily driving. Red herring. This is a diversionary tactic that avoids the key issues, often by avoiding opposing arguments rather than addressing them. Example, the level of mercury in seafood may be unsafe, but what will fishers do to support their families? In this example, the author switches the discussion away from the safety of the foods and talks instead about an economic issue, the livelihood of those catching the fish. While one issue may affect the other, it does not mean we should ignore possible safety issues because of possible economic consequences to a few individuals. Now, it's time to practice. In today's presentation, we have reviewed what deductive reasoning is, inductive reasoning, syllogisms, and how to identify logical fallacies. I challenge you to go either watch an argument online or read an argument and identify whether or not they've used deductive or inductive reasoning and if they've committed any logical fallacies. See if you can point out some of the fallacies that we discussed today. Thank you for visiting my channel, and until next time, happy researching.